Central Florida, and I'm pleased to see some of you coming from nursing school, where my background is. And please allow me, before I start, to thank Professor Anini and his colleagues. Let me thank Professor John Anini and his colleagues at the College of Central Florida for inviting me to this beautiful campus to speak in this panel session. I would also like to thank the Fulbright Scholar Program for selecting me and 9 more Jordanian scholars from different disciplines to come to 10 different prestigious universities in the United States. I have the privilege of coming to the University of Pittsburgh, in the lovely city of Pittsburgh, with 3 rivers and over 400 bridges. In this presentation, I will talk briefly about Jordan, the historical migrations, and the migrations of the Palestinians, the Iraqis, the Syrians, and other Arab immigrants. I will also discuss some challenges and problems. The Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan is a small country in the Middle East, with an area of 35,000 square miles, almost the same size as the state of Maine on the east coast of the United States. To the west, I think I can find it easy to... Oh, just fly right. Yeah, okay, that's better, yeah. To the west, it is bordered by Israel and the West Bank. To the north, Syria, and a large arid desert separates it from Iraq from the north and Saudi Arabia from the south. Modern Jordan was part of the Levant, that is Bilad al-Sham, which is Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. It was under the rule of the Ottoman Turkish Empire from 1516 until the end of the World War I. In 1918. Jordan gained independence in 1921 as the Emirate of Transjordan under the British Mandate. In 1946, it gained independence from Great Britain and was named the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. The 2015 population census, published in February 2016, showed the total population of 9.5 million and 2.9 million, which is about 30% of the population, were non-Jordanian. And that is equivalent to 98 million foreign nationals living in America. This graph shows the population explosion following the refugee influx. As you can see, this happened after the Palestine, the influx of the Palestinians in 1948 and 1967, and the refugees from Iraq in 1991, and the Syrian refugees in 2011. The blue line, the one at the bottom, shows the growth of foreign nationals, starting from 1948, or we don't have a record of that, but the most recent surveys and census, Jordanian census start from 1979 and it goes upwards. And the green one shows the population explosion in Jordan from very early until recent, up to 9 million. And the one in the middle, the gray color, it shows if Jordan did not receive any influx, the normal growth rate, had Jordan not received any refugees. So we would be around 2 million if we did not have any refugees coming to Jordan. Lieutenant General Sir John Glob, the British commander of the Jordan Arab Army from 1930 to 1956, in his book, A Soldier with the Arabs, said, and I quote, "From 1932 to 1948, the whole of Jordan was indeed one of the happiest little countries in the world. We were so happy until 1948. End of quote. Here's an idea of the early migrations to Jordan. In the mid-19th century, the Algerian Arabs in 1950, who were the first wave of Arab immigrants who fled the French colonial persecution, and some of them settled in Jordan. This was followed, the Algerian, this was followed by the Circassian in 1885, and the Chechens in 1902, and the Armenians in 1915, the Kurds in 1920, and the Druze from Syria in 1925. The estimated number of the combined descendants of these early migrants is 250,000. They are completely integrated in the Jordanian society. They speak Arabic and intermarry with native speakers, with native Jordanians. They enrich the country with their cultural heritage and folklore, music, and cuisine. They formed groups and clubs to preserve their heritage. This shows that traditionally, Circassians, they form the royal ceremonial guard, so they come from Circassia. These are the Armenians, completely integrated into the Jordanian society. Now the next wave of migrations. In 1948, were the Palestinians, were migrants or became migrants to Jordan. So it is the more recent migrations. The Palestinians represent the longest unresolved refugee problem in the world. They underwent repeated migrations in 1948, 1967, 1991, 2000, and 2011. It's a very complicated problem affected by national, regional, and global politics. This is how it came. Like in 1948, there were 100,000 migrants to the East Bank of Jordan. There were also 400,000 coming migrated to the West Bank. A total of 500,000 migrated to Jordan, and they were all given the Jordanian citizenship in 1950 with the unification of the East Bank and the West Bank. There was a second migration in 1967, okay? That is after the second Arab-Israeli war and the occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip. Another refugee crisis took place. More refugees, some of them second-timers, some of these who fled the first time to the West Bank came to the East Bank, so they were called second-timers. Some of them second-timers, and the total of 700,000 fled to the East Bank of Jordan. Later, in 1991, and after the Gulf War, we had more returnee Palestinians with Jordanian citizenship came from Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and that was 330,000 migrants coming to Jordan in over 2 years. Due to the Intifada, or what we call the uprising in Palestine and Gaza Strip, we have more refugees coming from the occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And in 2012, there are more Palestinian refugees coming from Syria, because they were living in Syria as Palestinian, and with the civil war, they migrated to Jordan. Here comes the United Nations Relief and Work Agency, the UNRWA. To deal with the Palestinian refugees, the United Nations Relief and Work Agency was established to take care of the Palestinian refugees in the West Bank, Jordan, Gaza Strip, Syria, and Lebanon. They had to deal with the Jordanian citizenship, those who fled or came to Jordan. Some of them had Jordanian citizenship, some were without Jordanian citizenship, and they were about 370,000 who live in refugees camps. These camps are located in the north, two in the north, in the Irbid and Qasm area, two in Jarash, one in Zarqa, and 5 camps in the Amman area, the capital of Jordan. These camps started as a collection of tents, gradually built to be into bricks and mortar dwellings. And actually some of them are still like that. Next comes the Arab refugees. So the Arab refugees came from Lebanon in 1975 due to the civil war in Lebanon, the Iraqi-Iran war in 1980, between 1980 and 1988, in 1991 due to the first Gulf War, in 2003 due to the second Gulf War, due to the Syrian conflict, starting from 2011 up to the present. There were some Libyan coming from due to the civil war, and Yemenis. What about the Iraqi refugees? The Iraqi refugees, they came in 1980 to 1988 in the Iraq-Iran war, 1990-91 Gulf War, 2003, 2004, and 2005 due to the Gulf War too. The figures. This slide shows the number of Iraqis in Jordan during these wars. As you can see, it's increased from 24,500 in 2004 and up to 500,000 in 2007, and now it is about 1,300,000 people due to relocation. And that's at this moment. Now it is not the UN, the UNRWA. It is the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. It was created by the United Nations to deal with the non-Palestinian worldwide refugees. The UNHCR is responsible in assisting voluntary return to Iraq, the resettlement in a third country, and it supervises the stay in Jordan for a period of 6 months, and it can be extended. It is governed by a memorandum of understanding signed with the Jordanian government. The Syrian Civil War. The Syrian Civil War started in March 2011 and still going on. The United Nations, or the Syrian conflict, the civil that started during the Arab Spring as peaceful demonstrations in March 2011, it progressed into an ongoing civil war for the last 5 years. The UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon recently described the situation saying, "The situation in Syria is as close to hell as we are likely to find on earth." End of quote. There are 7.5 million internally displaced Syrians, 4 million refugees who fled to Turkey, to Lebanon, to Jordan, there's over 500,000, and to Europe. The 2015 census shows that 1.25 million Syrians resided in Jordan, equaling 13.3% of our population. If compared to the state of Florida, it is like 2.7 million immigrants coming to the state over 4 years. And this is the distribution of the Syrians in the country. As we can see, they are located in the north of Jordan because it is bordering Syria. So there are 37% of the refugees live in Mafra, 10% live in Irbid, the 2 cities in the north, and 10% living in the capital Amman. Here is the world-famous Zaatari camp. Probably some of you have watched it on the news or on the internet. So the famous Zaatari camp, the largest Syrian refugee camp, which housed about 130,000 refugees in 2012. It was described as the 4th largest city in Jordan. This is an aerial picture of the camp. Another one is the nearby Azraq camp, it's also in the north, composed of metal shelters, is the 2nd largest camp, housing over 29,000 refugees. The same story of camps is repeated. Instead of UNRWA, it is UNHCR this time. Of course, refugees, they have their own challenges and they have their own needs. So some of the needs were reception at the border, medical care, vetting, transport, shelter, protection. Here I'll leave you with a video for probably 1.5 minutes. This video has been released recently, a couple of days ago. shows the whole story. It shows our challenges. So most of the refugees are children. Most of the refugees are children, women, elderly who came, sometimes walking for days until they reached the borders. Some needed carrying. Okay. Yes, so they were carried by the border guards. Some were injured, who needed medical care. Some needed life-saving measures. Refugees were transported into camps by buses, by trucks, or by pickups. They needed shelter, which was hurriedly provided by the UNHCR and later transformed into Zaatari camp, which was officially opened in 2012. The challenges, we have water challenges, food, sanitation, healthcare, education, housing, work, and relocation. As for water, it is a very scarce resource in Jordan. Jordan is the third poorest country in water in the world. We have no surface water, no rivers, no lakes, and no desalination plants. We rely on underground water, which analysts predict will be depleted by 2060, which means no water for the children of these children. In Mafra, the Syrian refugee quadrupled demand for water, and the availability is less than 30 liters per person per day. The basic human need is 80 liters per day. In 2013, in a nearby village, the host population rioted, protesting water shortage, and closed the public highway, which needed the personal intervention of King Abdullah II to go there and calm the populace. In Mafra, the drainage and waste disposal infrastructure was stretched to its limit. The Syrian refugees increased the solid waste by 60 tons per day, this exceeded the capacity of the municipality to collect and dispose of waste. In 2014, the United States Agency for International Aid estimated Mafra's needs at $30 million to be able to deal with the problem, and this is 5 times its total budget. Due to donor fatigue and funding shortages, the humanitarian aid groups were forced to restrict food aid through 2014. As for health, in Mafra, the Syrian refugees overcrowded the primary healthcare facilities, causing shortages of hospital beds, medicines, and vaccinations. The Ministry of Health reported the re-emergence of previously controlled diseases like poliomyelitis, tuberculosis, and measles. The schools, half of the Syrian refugees are under the age of 18. To enroll Syrian students, the Ministry of Education resorted to shortening class times, overcrowding the classrooms, and double shifting in the form of morning and evening classes, and this resulted in the dissatisfaction of the population. As for housing, outside the camps in the city of Mafra, the Syrian refugees outnumbered the local residents, that is 120 versus 90,000. The increased demand for rented houses led to a shortage of available units and 6-time increase in the rental prices. This competition with the host population caused further dissatisfaction and unrest. This is a distribution of the people in 2015. The Jordanian are, the whole population is 9.5. Non-Jordanians are almost 3 million, and that is 30% of the population. We have 636,000 Egyptian people and about 50,000 of Yemenis and Libyans. The population in the Amman, which is the capital, we have 4 million living in Amman, of which 1.5 million almost non-Jordanian, and it's almost 36% of the population. Jordan is a small, war-weary country with no natural resources, or oil, or gas. It is hosting 2.9 million foreign nationals. As a result, Jordan is facing resource depletion, challenges on the economic, demographic, security, and political levels, and to survive in a turbulent, war-torn region, Jordan needs more than handshakes, more than royalty, visits by royalty, more than well-meaning, and more than celebrity compassion. It needs financial aid and real solution to the problem. And thank you very much.
All right. What I'm going to do, I didn't realize it'd be a class. Is go through stuff that you need to know. First of all, about me, I spent 2 years in a refugee camp in the Philippines. How I got started into this stuff. Doing my PhD, the refugee camp was full of Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians from a previous major refugee outflow. And then I spent time in Cambodia on what we call repatriation. I'll talk about repatriation and how that works. What I'm going to do is explain what a refugee is, how the whole thing is dealt with, so that you understand sort of what we're talking about when we talk about refugees, and sort of separating it out from migrants to the degree that it's possible. Now, the way the refugee thing works, as she pointed out, they created something called UNRWA in Palestine before the actual UNHCR was created. And that still persists to this day. And it's a special case, and it's only in Palestine. In 1951, after the creation of the United Nations, post-World War II, you had the creation, essentially, of sort of the refugee definition and the refugee protocols that we have now to the present time. So that there was something called the Convention on Refugees from 1951 that was signed by most of the countries in Europe. The United States signed on to this. There are countries that have not signed on to the convention. Indonesia is a good example. Malaysia is another one. There are some other ones I'll talk about. But in that protocol, we have a definition of refugees. And that definition persists till this day. And so we'll talk about sort of what it does and doesn't apply to. So for example, any person who, owing to a well-founded fear of persecution, all right, in their place of habitual origin, and that's at, you know, their basic country like this, fear of persecution based on political opinion, race, religion, nationality, or membership of a particular social group, and crosses an international boundary. This is very important. So if you establish a well-founded fear of persecution in your country of origin, your habitual residence, and then you cross an international border, then you are eligible to be considered a refugee. You're eligible. That doesn't make it automatic. This is important to clarify something that people said a couple of years ago when they were talking about refugees coming to the United States, the whole sort of little kids coming from Central America. I don't know if you remember this. You're supposed to say yes. Okay. The whole big deal was in the news, and people were saying, well, to be a refugee, you apply at the embassy of the country that you're at. No, you don't. You can't be a refugee until you cross an international border. And this is a definition that was established primarily by Europeans in the United States. All right? The other thing that's very important about this definition is, what do you have a well-founded fear of persecution of? Based on your religion, based on your politics, based on your ethnicity, based on membership in a particular group. But it's extremely important to understand that you are a refugee as an individual. So that if you cross an international border and you want to seek status as a refugee somewhere, you seek it as an individual, not as a group. This is extremely important. So when we talk about the actual process the refugees go through, they go through it as individuals, all right? And this is also built into the definition, the legal definition of what a refugee is, and that persists to this day. The exception is that the Organization of African Unity created sort of a different one to apply to certain situations in Africa, where being a member of a traditional group would automatically allow you to be a refugee within the OAU, but that's relatively small. All right. Now then, what they also did at the time, not too long after this, the original definition, by the way, and protocol for refugees in 1951 was only for refugees in Europe. It was post-World War II. You had huge numbers of people in Europe that were out of place, in essence. You had people that had been moved around into labor camps. You had people that had been moved around for other reasons. And you also had in Europe, post-World War II, some changes in who was governing which countries. So that some of the traditional sort of governance of a place like Poland, for example, changed so that Poland became part of the USSR, you guys remember this stuff, which is now gone, but and people who found themselves in other places in Europe decided, I don't want to go back there because of what's happened in the change. So that they became sort of this massive displaced population that existed in Europe, and that's what this was originally to deal with. You had essentially what we'll call displaced persons camps in Europe. All right, so the UN was founded, and then one of the first problems they dealt with was, what do we do with all these people who are not where they were originally supposed to be, and also don't want to go back to where they were from because they have this fear that if they go back, they're going to be persecuted because of the changes that have taken place. So they came up with this definition of refugee. Here it is. In 1967, this was extended to refugees all over the world. So it's no longer just applying to refugees in Europe. As situations changed over time, then you had essentially a change in the realization that refugee situations were going to take place. Now, just because this happened in '51 and the United Nations was formed, as you saw in the presentation, poor Jordan is one of those countries, it's like Thailand was during sort of the post-Vietnam War thing, where you had refugees coming from every direction into Thailand. You just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and be the stable place where everything else is falling apart. And so Thailand had to deal with Cambodian refugees, Vietnamese refugees. You had people coming in from what was Burma, now Myanmar. Jordan is having the same situation. They're stable. Every place else falls apart in a way. Now then, when they created the convention in 1951, they also created something called the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. It's also very important to understand what the UNHCR is and is not. It is an agency of the United Nations. It is the agency that's designated to deal with refugee situations. But unlike other agencies of the United Nations, probably the World Food Program is probably the best sort of counterexample. They are not given a giant budget. Here, deal with refugees with all this money. No. They are given a budget that's basically an administration budget. What the UNHCR then has to do is go out and solicit funds to deal with specific refugee movements. They don't have this giant pool of money that they can just run around, oh, there's refugees over here. They have to go to the donor countries and request donations and support for that specific refugee situation, for that specific what they call refugee flows. All right? And so that when we talk about what's happening in Jordan or Lebanon, for example, where there's another huge population right now, other places, there are refugees in Africa, all over the place. Post-Vietnam War, the one I'm most familiar with, countries like Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia that had major influxes of Vietnamese leaving Vietnam and then Cambodians leaving when they were able to. There was a big crisis, and then the UNHCR asked for money to actually deal with the situation, create some place for the refugees to be, process for them to go through, providing some of the services that she talked about that refugees need, healthcare, food, shelter, for heaven's sake. But it's important to remember, so when you hear about, well, the refugee situation here, or here, or here, and why isn't someone doing something? Well, the UNHCR is doing something. It's asking for the resources to actually go there and deal with that. And when countries give money to the UNHCR, they give it for that refugee situation, or that refugee situation. And the UNHCR is constrained to some degree in terms of spreading that money around. This is in contrast to the World Food Program, if you notice the WFP, which actually goes out with a budget and buys food, stockpiles it to provide in situations where there's famine, but they also provide the food very often for refugee camps. And what they are able to do, the World Food Program, if you're aware of this or not, is look around the world and see where there's surpluses, and then spend money to buy stockpiles of food when it's cheap, and then have it on hand, and then have it ready to go to deal with other situations. The UNHCR can't do that. When you have a situation where you have a lot of people moving, and countries request help, and they go to donors, then they can buy the tents, then they can buy the cars, then they can talk to the World Food Program, they can get the NGOs, as we call them, I'll talk about this in a minute, that are able to deal with the ones that actually get on the ground and actually provide the services to refugees. This is an important sort of consideration, all right? So that, you know, people say, why isn't someone doing something? Well, you know, it's because they just don't have that kind of giant, you know, bank of money to just run in there and do something. You have administrative people go in, do investigations, look around, assess the need, but that need has to be filled by actual donor countries donating to that situation. It's one reason UNRWA still persists to this day, is that countries pay for the continuation of UNRWA in Palestine all the way up until the present from 1948-49. All right, the next thing to make it really clear and talk about refugees is what is sort of the process. I'm used to waving my hands and walking around. What happens? All right, you have people that are living in a country, very often they know what they're doing, they know how things work, they have established, they've been there for generations, and things begin to change for whatever reason. And you talk about Syria, lots of debate about what actually led to, but what becomes a civil war, all right? People begin to feel a well-founded fear of persecution, yes? They begin to feel threatened. So, the first step to becoming a refugee is to flee. You move. This is important because there's a debate in refugee studies and refugee ideas around the world between what they call pull factors and push factors. Push is violence, in essence. You're afraid. You're afraid for yourself, for your kids, all right? Or you're in a situation in which you simply cannot go on as you have been going on for most of your life. You have been excluded. You have been, essentially, because you're on the wrong side of politics, religion, or something like this, your life is simply not going to go along as it had in the past. So that you begin basically to develop this sort of, you know, perception of a well-founded fear of persecution. You may not think about it in those terms, but, you know, I'm being persecuted, all right? Things that are going on. Then you leave. You must cross an international boundary to be considered a refugee. If you don't cross an international boundary, you're called internally displaced person. Now then, if you hear about this or read about this, one of the things that is true is that internally displaced people often have a well-founded fear of persecution based on religion, ethnicity, politics, or whatever, but they do not cross an international border, all right? What's the big deal about that? The UNHCR cannot do anything for internally displaced people, at least not intentionally, because it's not in their mandate. What has to happen then? The countries that are experiencing internally displaced people have to request assistance if they want to, all right? Or those people who are internally displaced have to become external, they have to leave, become refugees, all right? But in other ways, the characteristics and the needs of internally displaced people are not that much different, all right? It's just the situation as it exists, as it is now. And there's lots of debate about whether that categorical distinction should exist. But it does. What it does do is ensure, though, that people who do flee international boundaries get, essentially, the protection that they do, all right? So, to become a refugee, you flee, all right? Then you are in another country that may have requested the UNHCR to come in. What does the UNHCR do? They contract other people, or they themselves conduct interviews with people who do what they call assert asylum. If you are a signatory to the 1951 convention, you are obligated to provide an opportunity for anyone coming into your country who requests asylum to give them an interview, a hearing, and determine if they actually have a well-founded fear of persecution. You are required legally to do this. Do all countries do this? No. If you don't do this, there's a really cool term for what you do to them if you don't. It's called refoulement. I really like this term. Anyway, it means sending people back without giving them an opportunity to establish that they have a well-founded fear of persecution. All right? And it's the United States has signed this treaty, for example, which makes it part of our law, but it doesn't necessarily always work out that way. Although in many cases it does. All right? The next thing that happens after you have an interview, all right, and you're accepted as a refugee, is that you're granted asylum. If the UNHCR is operating in that place, the UNHCR can provide assistance, but one of the things that's most important the UNHCR is supposed to provide is protection. Protection against what? What's called involuntary repatriation. That means sending you back without you agreeing to. The UNHCR is supposed to prevent that. So they are supposed to provide protection against what? Being pushed back into the situation that you were fleeing from in the first place. Because countries do like to do this, push you back. I mean, they don't want to have this giant influx, as you can imagine. All right, what happens next? What can happen to a refugee post sort of being granted asylum, being granted refugee status, is sort of, you know, when does this being a refugee end, if it ever does, which in some cases it never does. We talk about UNRWA and other places as well. What can you do? You can be what's called resettled in first country. In other words, the country that you fled to, they can say, sure, you can stay here, you can live here, you can even become a citizen. If you reach a point where you actually become a citizen of another country, all right, then you're no longer a refugee, yes? That's one option, okay? The second option is that that country can say, no, 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 you can't stay here. You have to go somewhere else, all right, wherever that may be. Other countries can provide what's called second country asylum. In other words, resettlement to another country. So you flee one country, you're there, you're granted asylum, you're allowed to stay there, but they're not going to let you stay there as a citizen forever. You just simply have asylum. Therefore, you must go somewhere else. You can either go to a new country, or we'll talk about repatriation and going back home again. Second country resettlement, or even third country resettlement, depending, is where other countries like the United States or France or Britain or whatever, all right, agree to take countries, refugees from places where they've gotten first asylum and resettle them. So, for example, a lot of Vietnamese, over 1 million Vietnamese came to the United States post-World Vietnam War as refugees and were resettled in the United States and had assistance for a year. But they went through the basic process. They were refugees for a year or two, then they began the citizenship process, and at the end of, I guess what is now 5 years, at one time it was 7 years, I guess 5 now, you can become a citizen and you're no longer a refugee, all right? You're no longer sort of a resident alien even, all right? So it ends. It can end, or it might not end. The other option is what's called voluntary repatriation. You stay in a country that you've been granted asylum in for a while, things in your home country or place of original habitation improve, and then you agree with the UNHCR, I'll go back home, all right, and resume your life back there. That's another option. The third option, or another option, is you can just be a refugee forever, which happens in some cases. I know I'm running out of time. All right. I wanted to make all this really clear. So that you understand what a refugee is, you understand the process, sort of what can happen to refugees. This is all kind of laid out. And it's clear. What makes refugees different from people who are classified as migrants is the difference between push and pull, all right? People don't sort of get sucked into being refugees, they get pushed, all right? But there's an important consideration, especially related to what is happening now in places like Syria and the impact on places like Europe and other places, is that once refugee flows start, they don't stop until the situation changes. is something that people don't get in certain respects. It's like, well, if we let these people in, it will only encourage more. So we have to keep them out. Well, you keep them out, but you're still going to get more. You're going to get more because the reasons people are leaving aren't going away. All right? The Thais tried this. The Cambodians were leaving Cambodia, and they said, we're not going to let the Cambodians into Thailand, and we're going to put landmines up there. That's not the best thing to do. But, and so that they won't come. Well, they kept coming anyway. I mean, it's not going to change unless the situation changes. That's one thing to consider when you're thinking about this. All right? I was going to talk about what some of the solutions for Europe, but I guess I'm running out of time here. I'm used to a 50-minute class. So I'll stop there.
We'll come back to great questions and answers.
Okay, sure. Well, thank you very much, both of you. Thank you for the long history of Jordan. I learned a lot, I think we all did, from looking at her statistics, the history of that country. I think she really illustrated that there are significant problems with the refugee situation in Jordan. Thank you for the demographics. There were a lot of snapshots of the population. I took away that 30% of Jordan is now non-Jordanian. I think that's pretty significant. And then from your talk, I gleaned, well, first of all, thank you for the mini history lesson. I think a lot of students lack a good historical foundation nowadays from their public schools. And also the explanation of the UNHCR. I think that was very valuable to understand how, because a lot of young people have hearts and they want to give and help, but they don't know how. I remember when the Haitian earthquake took place, a lot of people were texting, you know, like $1 of foreign aid, and so a lot of people want to help, so you breaking down how they can help and how this is all organized is very helpful, and the World Food Program was helpful too. And also for explaining the refugee experience from start to finish. I think it's very helpful and it helps everyone become educated. May I please ask questions now? Is that
sure.
what we do? Just because you're a Fulbright scholar, you've come to the United States, you are, you know, your audience here are, you know, American students. I'd like to ask a little bit about, you know, how the United States felt about Syrian refugees coming here. Because you have so much experience in Jordan, them coming to your country, could you share a little bit about, for example, are any of the fears warranted of the United States population? You know, should we be fearful of Syrian refugees coming to our country? Because their culture is so different from our culture. For example, if we're from a Judeo-Christian background and we know that isn't 90% of Jordan an Islamic population,
Yes.
that can be very frightening to people. So could you just talk a little bit about that?
Thank you very much. That's a very good question. Yes, I believe, you know, there are some stereotypes everywhere, and America is the same like everywhere. In Jordan, you know, although they are 90%, or in Jordan, or the Arab world, there are more Muslims than Christians, but that doesn't mean that they are all terrorists. It's only groups, some groups, they have, you know, some certain kind of ideology or beliefs that they want to do something as terrorists. But that does not mean, you know, that all the Arabs or the Muslims are terrorists. And Syrians, as they come to Jordan, for example, we do all the job. Before they come and be part of the population, they are vetted. It means the security, as we see the video, there are the security borders over there, and they check everybody. They check all entries, especially men, for example. Women and children are allowed entry as an easier way to do that. But for men, they are scrutinized. They are vetted very well, so that nobody can be allowed entry. And those, as we have seen on the video also, there were some kind of smuggling, drugs, and weapons. So they were returned and not allowed to come in. So we do the first job, then probably the United States can do a better job in vetting and doing this. So as for a culture, as for an Islamic culture or for a Muslim, we are like everybody, human beings. If you are forced to be a terrorist, then you should have some sort of something that's fearing you. But not everybody is like that, and Syrians are very nice humans, and they are just fleeing the cruelty of the system and so on. So it doesn't mean that the stereotype is
Which brings me to the root source of the problem.
I wanted to say just one thing about that.
Sure.
I want to make it really clear. I mean, when you get an interview to become granted asylum, that's one thing. The thing that scares refugees, especially when it comes to the United States, was the INS, now it's ICE. And you have no idea. Now, one point to make is that a lot of you probably couldn't get through an interview to be resettled from where you are. When someone sits down and they've got a binder like this, and they know about all kinds of events to ask you about where you say you're from, what happened when, and if you lie, you don't come. This interview is not, oh, you have an interview, how are you doing today? No, this is a serious thing. And people who go through it, I mean, I spend a lot of time with refugees, you know, and it's the one thing, it's scary, and you can get turned down. And you can get turned down multiple times, and you can get turned off. I mean, it's just like, you know, if they catch you lying, they won't let you in. I just want to make that.
I was, go ahead.
Dr. Faris, something you see?
Sure.
Yes, as far as the United States is concerned, if a Syrian in Jordan, now we have 1.5 million, applies to come to the United States, actually the process takes 2 years for that person to be moved from Jordan to the United States. And 2 years, you know, all the security agencies, and I think the security agencies in the United States are the most efficient. If somebody slips, that's just an isolated case, and people should never be frightened, because it takes them 2 years, actually, to be transferred.
I'd just like, if we could talk about the root cause of the problem, why the refugees are in fact becoming refugees or displaced persons, and also you talk a little bit about humanitarian aid and the fact that we maybe are not giving enough money, and I guess I would like to know how you feel about military action. I mean, if we need to, I guess, explore that. I mean, what about strengthening certain groups in the region, such as the Assyrians, who are more aligned with Western beliefs, for example? Do you think there's any, hope in getting to the root cause of the problem, which would be people who are terrorizing, internally in Syria? How can we not strengthen Syrians and let refugees stay where they are? Is it arrogant to assume that they want to go to, again, with the United States, assimilate into the country? Would it not be more cost effective too, to make sure that we could, because I've read some statistics that it costs 12 times as much to resettle a certain immigrant, for example, into the United States than it would be to help them stay in their local region, where of course their cultures, their customs, their traditions are more like their own. So I'm just wondering about military action, the source of the problem, cost, things like that. Would either of you like to address that?
The problem is the Civil War. You're not going to solve the Civil War. The Civil War is going to get solved on its own. You may know something from your history about the United States and how that worked out. The same thing happened in Vietnam. To a large degree, Vietnam was a civil war that had started in the 1600s. It sort of died out in the 1700s. Then when the French left after, it picked up again. And it didn't end until it ended. It ended when you had somebody won, somebody lost. That's what's going to happen in Syria. Although now it's gotten more complicated because you have Russians in it. It's not going to end, which means the flow of refugees is not going to end. The solution for people who are dealing with this is to realize it's not going to end. We're going to have to deal with all these people sitting here. There's two ways that refugees get dealt with. You put them in camps, as you saw, but there's a lot of refugees in Jordan that aren't in camps, the Iraqis especially, who are urbanized, we call them. In other words, they're just there. It makes it very hard to provide assistance, to know who they are, how many of them there are, especially in a larger place. It's simply not, so you deal with it. Until the Civil War ends, the Civil War doesn't end. And that's just how it works. So they're going to keep coming until the situation changes. That's how it's going to be.
So how can we strengthen that government so the Civil War doesn't, or not a corrupt government?
You can't talk about that because it's an internal issue, so they have to deal with their own problems. All what we can do as parties from outside is to help the humanitarian issues. Other than that, it's not our job. They have to deal with it. If there are some external forces that are encouraging this kind of civil war, it has to be to manage the situation.